I think everyone's fairly familiar, I hope, with the Professor Peter Ridd story. Peter Credlin and I interviewed Professor Ridd on our television program in August 2017, and he rightly criticised the quality of Great Barrier Reef research at James Cook University. In other words, he refused to conform to the university's groupthink about climate change. He was sacked. He simply said on our TV program, quote, "The science is coming out not properly checked, tested or replicated. Most of the scientists who are pushing this stuff, they genuinely believe there are problems with the reef. I just don't think they're very objective about the science. I think they're emotionally attached." He was sacked. He took James Cook University to court, and earlier this year the Federal Circuit Court, after a 3-day hearing, found the university's treatment of this distinguished professor was unlawful. The court ruled that the 17 findings made by the university, the 2 speech directions, the 5 confidentiality directions, the no satire direction, the censure and the final censure given by the university, and the termination of employment were all unlawful. It was a triumph. One would have thought the judgment might wake some people up to the global warming hoax. I'm not sure, although, as I said, Penny Wong's comments recently are to her great credit when she said that coal must continue to be a significant part of our energy mix for years to come. Professor Ridd said on my program that organisations like the Australian Institute of Marine Science could no longer be trusted. He said, as a scientist, to question the proposition that the reef is damaged is a potentially career-ending move. And until the federal court decision, for him, it was. He'd been at James Cook University for 40 years. He'd given his entire working life to James Cook University. But he was charged with, quote, deliberately denigrating the university and its employees. Interestingly, at the time, the National Tertiary Education Union rose to Professor Ridd's defence. And in a letter its union members said, quote, defence of the core values of genuine academic freedom is not well served by the corporate top-down, anti-collegial and managerialist structure and culture in today's universities. Now, there are 2 reasons I wanted to talk to Professor Ridd today. I'll come to the Barrier Reef in a moment, about which untruths are still being told. But recently he wrote that he'd been in court fighting James Cook University for compensation over his unlawful dismissal. And he said, but as I said in the witness stand, I couldn't help thinking how our science institutions could learn a lot from the legal institutions about how to have a true contest of evidence, a contest where everything is challenged and where both sides have equal opportunity to make their case, a contest that will bring us closer to the truth. He said the legal proceedings were simple enough. The university, I contended, had taken away my job, damaged my employment prospects, and generally caused a fair bit of needless grief. But the judge wasn't going to listen to only my side of the argument. And despite the university no longer being my favourite organisation, it had every right to challenge me. He said it is potentially liable to a big compensation claim and has employed eminent Sydney barrister Yassine Sharif, whose job it was to question all my evidence and claims. I had top barrister Ben Kidston in my corner. When Sharif got up to grill me, he made a small smile that reminded me of a fox about to track a rabbit. I've been told that Sharif is a perfect gentleman, but at that moment he had a job to do. It was to challenge me, not to be nice to me. He says Judge Salvatore Vasta watched and listened. And here's the bit. Professor Ridd said, I watched and thought, if only this guaranteed questioning of evidence occurred in the environmental sciences. I'm used to one side hijacking the debate and excluding opposing ideas and evidence. He said in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, I'm one of the few experts on the movement of mud sourced from farms that's supposedly killing the reef. My group has collected more data on this issue than all the other groups put together, yet I'm excluded from the consensus group of marine biologists who tell the government that the reef is smothered by mud. He said our work indicates that this is a ridiculous proposition with no evidence to support it. He said, in Australia we would never accept a rigged legal system where the prosecution, the defence, the judge, the jury were effectively the same person. We would not accept them, excluding evidence they didn't like. He said it's unsurprising that the legal system, which has taken centuries to develop, is far ahead of the science institutions. He said we need to develop institutions to make sure the more nebulous evidence from the environmental sciences is subject to legal-style guaranteed examination. All evidence, no matter how solid it may seem, must be subjected to antagonist scrutiny. He said we need the scientific equivalent of Sharif. Well, that leads him, because Dr. Peter Ridd is halfway through a Queensland lecture tour promoted by agricultural industries who are facing new, strict reef water quality legislation currently before the Queensland Parliament, which would damage agricultural industries. Peter Ridd has long argued the research which claims the reef is under threat and dying is faulty. Professor Ridd's on the line. Peter Ridd, good morning.
Morning.
Good on you. You make that very valid point that our legal system is not without its problems, because nonetheless we all worry about the decisions that are made, but at the same time evidence is contested. It's not in environmental science.
Exactly. I mean, the legal system, as you say, has its problem, but it's nowhere near as bad as the environmental sciences.
Yeah, and you say we wouldn't accept a rigged legal system where the prosecution, the defence, the judge and the jury, but you can't challenge any of this stuff, or you cop the sack like you, or you cop all sorts of vile vilification like I cop, simply because you take a position on the hoax that is climate change. The evidence is not analysed. They seek to shut up one side.
Exactly, and it's not just climate change in this case, it's the farmers who are going to have potentially massive new regulations put on them. Though there is good news, it looks like the state government has at least delayed implementing the legislation, I think partly due to the campaign by the farmers and our lecture tour.
But as you say, you've made the point, my group has collected more data on this issue, that's this business about mud, the movement of mud sourced from farms flowing in to the reef, supposedly killing it. My group's collected more data on this issue than all the other groups put together, yet I'm excluded from the consensus group of marine biologists that are telling the government the reef is smothered in mud. And it's not.
Exactly. I mean, if you go to the Great Barrier Reef proper, which is 40 to 100 kilometres offshore, there just is no mud out there. The scientists keep on going on about the inshore reefs, and that sounds like a lot of coral inshore, but it's actually 1% of the coral, and all our data suggests that even that 1% is not affected by the farms. The good news is that because we've been pushing this recently, even the Australian Institute of Marine Science is agreeing with me that the Great Barrier Reef, 99% of the coral, they're saying, or at least agreeing, is not affected by farmers. We should be telling the whole world about this.
Yes. I mean, I read the Master Reef Guide. Natalie Lobatolo has a first-hand window into what the world thinks about the Great Barrier Reef. She says the most common comment from tourists after they experience the reef and waters around Lady Musgrave Island, where she works, is, I thought the reef was dead, but it's amazing. And then you've got the Environment Minister, Susan Lee, who's been there recently, and you've spoken to her. She snorkeled over 2 reefs. She said she found it difficult to reconcile what she saw in the water with what had been said around the world. She said the reef is not dead, it's not dying. I'd not even say it's on life support. This is the Minister. Tourism operators want a very clear message that the reef is definitely not dead, that it's amazing and one of the true wonders of the world, and it's worth visiting. Well, of course, the other side present a case, and it's unchallenged. That's your point.
Exactly, and it's an incredible situation. You just need to go to the reef, and the idea that this thing is damaged is one of the triumphs of misinformation, that you could have something that is so brilliant. Hoax,
we call it, Peter, hoax.
I guess so, yeah.
And I mean, here we are that as a result, though you say that the government have held off on the water quality regulations, which would severely damage agriculture in that area, because you say there is no land sediment on the reef from runoff from agricultural processes.
Precisely, and yet there's going to be all these new rules, not just on sediment, but also on application of fertiliser, which will really affect these struggling agricultural industries all up the coast from Bundaberg right up to the tip of Cape York Peninsula.
So limit the fertiliser they want to do, fertiliser used for crops and grain production, and this covers agricultural activities in all Great Barrier Reef catchments. I mean, the simple point you are making, and we'll make again, there has been a massive exaggeration of threats to the Great Barrier Reef, and you are saying, this is Professor Peter Ridd, there is an urgent need for an independent body to run through the Auditor-General's office and examine the science used for public policy. Not just, Peter Ridd, on the Great Barrier Reef, I might add.
No, exactly. There are lots and lots of environmental problems which we need to look at. The Murray-Darling is another one.
There you go.
But the good news is I think that this idea is getting some traction, certainly within the Liberal and National Party, and I suspect that the Labor will come around eventually when they see, because it's just a sensible thing to do, I think.
I mean, how did we get here? I mean, I've just been talking about the energy crisis. Because of this, we're now facing blackouts. It's unbelievable. I mean, we've suffered a stack of these hoaxes. I mentioned this morning, this is just one, the global warming hoax, the Great Barrier Reef hoax, the Y2K, remember that hoax? Yep. I mean, we've been affected by stacks of them. But, I mean, why? See, one of the reasons, Peter, is those people in government do no homework. And the bureaucrats feed them this stuff. They mouth it out. Having once said it, they then can't backtrack from a position they'd previously taken.
True, but at the bottom of a lot of these things is the unreliable and untrustworthy science institutions. It's very hard for a minister to say, the Institute of Marine Science or CSIRO is wrong. They'd be labelled a denier or anti-science or something like that. So we've got to sheet most of the blame back to these unreliable science institutions.
And that's why, as you say, we need an independent body which can examine the science, all the science that is used for public policy. As in the legal system, these things need to be challenged.
Precisely.
And those who challenge them, like you, are silenced. You're wonderful. You keep talking.
Sorry, it's certainly a massive problem, and I'm sure it can be fixed, and I'm sure it will be fixed in the next few years, and I'm sure that we're going to be able to convince the whole world that the reef is fine. There's an interesting feeling amongst the farmers at the moment that before they were just in desperation, they thought that nothing could be done. Now they feel that something can be done.
Got a voice. Good on you.
Yeah, that's
Good
right.
on you. We'll keep talking. You keep talking. Great to talk to you. Professor Peter Ridd.